Hey guys, enjoy these new 20 stories. We hope you enjoy them. Let us know your thoughts. And as always, most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please smash that subscribe button and hit that like button too. It's free and does so much for us. We're forever grateful. Now to the stories.
It started with her texting me that she'd be running a few minutes behind because her babysitter canceled. I said no problem, even offered to push the reservation back, but she told me she'd still make it. So I'm sitting at this kind of cozy ramen bar, the type of spot where the music's loud enough to make conversation feel more like a choice than a necessity. And I'm just sipping on this cucumber soda, wondering if I got stood up. Then she walks in, all smiles, a little breathless like she actually ran. She looked really good, not overdressed or anything. Just that effortless kind of good that makes you think she probably always looks like that, even when she's brushing her teeth. She apologizes for being late, slides into the booth across from me, and starts talking like we're picking up from an earlier conversation. I like that about her. Felt like we already knew each other a little. We get into talking, mostly surface stuff at first. She tells me about her job at the startup that makes eco-friendly pet toys. I'm telling her about how my office just started mandatory wellness check-ins, where you basically lie to HR for 10 minutes every month. Food comes. I get spicy miso, she gets the vegan one with all the mushrooms, and we're laughing because the server pronounced her name wrong in a way that somehow sounded like kale. Everything's going fine, really fine. She's funny, a little weird, but in a way that works. She talks with her hands, keeps adjusting her rings, and she's got this habit of pointing her chopsticks like she's making a point every time she says something serious. About halfway through my bowl, just as I'm telling her about this horrible sushi place I went to where they put hot Cheetos on everything, she suddenly leans in like really close and goes, "So, just so you know, I bring my son on all my dates." I thought she was joking, like maybe he was a metaphor for something, like she brings his memory or some deep emotional lesson or whatever. But then she tilts her head to the side like she's signaling something and says, "He's over there." I turn around and no lie, there's a little toddler, maybe 3, max, just sitting by himself at the next table. Little juice box, a little iPad with one of those padded rubber cases, just chilling like this is his Tuesday night routine. I didn't know what to say. I just blinked at him, and he blinked back like, "Yeah, I'm here too." I looked back at her, expecting some kind of follow-up explanation, like maybe she couldn't get a sitter and this was an emergency thing. But she's just sipping her soup, totally calm. Tells me she always does this. Says it's her way of seeing if the guy can vibe with her real life, and if he's got a problem with it, and it saves her time. I wasn't even mad, just confused. Like, this was some kind of long-term audition and I didn't even know it. She said she usually doesn't tell guys until midway through the date because she doesn't want them to overthink it. But now I was sitting there thinking way too much. I wasn't even sure what the rules were. Was I supposed to say hi to the kid? Did he need help opening his granola bar? Was there a diaper bag I was supposed to be aware of? So I start trying to ask questions without sounding judgmental, which is really hard when you're looking over someone's shoulder at a toddler trying to drag a noodle across his screen like it's a stylus. She says his name is Milo and says he's super chill and loves going out. Apparently, she takes him to all kinds of places. Coffee dates, bar patios, even trivia nights. Says it helps weed out the guys who aren't ready for reality. I'm still not totally sure if I'm part of some prank show or if this is just her normal. I ask, is it safe though? In sitting alone like that, she just shrugs and says the table's close enough. I mean, I guess technically it was, but still. There was a whole group of college kids right behind him doing shots of sake and yelling about some anime I've never heard of. Eventually, I offered to pay and she was cool with splitting it, which I appreciated because I wasn't trying to drop Raymond money on someone who low-key brought a third wheel. When the check came, she reached into her bag, handed her kid a fruit strip, and told him we were leaving in 5. The kid nodded like a little grown-up. Then he burped. We walked out together, the 3 of us. She held Milo's hand and talked to him like he was her roommate. I said goodbye and she said, "Let me know if you want to do this again," like it was no big deal. Like I just hung out with a friend and their extremely tiny mute roommate. The whole walk home I kept thinking about how casual she was about the whole thing. Like there were no warning signs, no car seat in her arms when she walked in, no mention of a child in the text before the date, nothing. Just surprised, here's a small human I'm legally responsible for, watching us eat from 3 feet away. I told my roommate about it when I got back and she was like, "That's actually kind of genius." instant screening process. Maybe she had a point, but it still threw me off. Not that she had a kid. Lots of people have kids. But that she turned it into this weird dating ritual without giving anyone a heads up. I didn't end up texting Kara again. Not because I couldn't handle dating someone with a child, but because I didn't love being tested like a school assignment halfway through my broth. There's probably a guy out there who'd love that setup. A guy who brings his niece to therapy or something and thinks it's normal. Just wasn't me. He was wearing a leather jacket that looked like it cost more than my rent, and he drove a car so shiny I saw my reflection in it from across the street. The date was at this rooftop bar that had those heaters that look like lamps from the future and drinks with names that don't tell you what's in them, just how you're supposed to feel after drinking them. I met Abraham through a friend of a friend, someone who claimed he was cool and grounded despite being insanely rich, which already sounded like a red flag hiding behind a compliment. But I was curious. Sue me. He smiled like he'd been practicing in the mirror, and his first words were a compliment about my shoes, followed immediately by him saying he appreciated a woman who invests in presentation. The way he said it made me feel like I was being judged in some silent competition I never signed up for. Still, he was charming. Not in a teeth-whitening commercial way, but more like someone who knows how to talk in a way that makes you forget to be annoyed. For a bit. We ordered drinks and he got something with Japanese whiskey in it. Told me how he only drinks stuff from specific regions because he likes to support ethical distilling. I didn't even know that was a thing. I got a hibiscus gin thing. I hoped it wasn't secretly just pink lemonade. The view was amazing though. You could see the skyline like it was made out of silver, and the lights from traffic below made the city look like it was breathing. It almost distracted me from how much he liked talking about himself. Abraham was one of those guys who talks in job titles. Like, he didn't just say what he did, he gave me his whole LinkedIn bio as an intro. Something about fintech and crypto infrastructure. The way he described his income was casual, like he didn't mean to mention it, but somehow still said it 3 times in the first hour. He made 7 figures a year, and no, he didn't grow up rich. He liked to remind me of that a lot. He built himself from scratch, like a furniture set that judges you if you mess up the instructions. I asked him what he liked to do outside of work, and he said he didn't believe in idle time, which honestly should have been why I left, but the drinks were good and I already ordered food. He told me he runs a few businesses on the side, invests in early startups, and once paid off his parents' mortgage before he turned 30. I nodded and smiled and tried to be impressed without looking like I was being impressed, which ironically impressed him. Dinner came, and we started eating. I got this weird truffle pasta that I thought would be small, but came out looking like a centerpiece, and he got steak, medium rare, and insisted on cutting it in very clean lines like it was a task he was being graded on. We talked about random stuff, movies, travel, childhood. He asked me about my goals in a way that felt like an interview question. When I told him I wanted to work in writing and content strategy, he raised an eyebrow and said, "So like marketing with storytelling?" I said, "Yeah, sort of." He said that was respectable, which sounded more like a pat on the head than a compliment. Then the check came. It sat there in its little black folder like a quiet dare. He looked at it, then looked at me and smiled. "Let's split it," he said. Now I don't mind splitting bills. I'm not someone who expects to be wined and dined like it's the 1950s. But something about the way he said it made me pause. Not because of the money, but because he followed it up with this whole monologue about how he does this with all the women he dates. Apparently, he tests them this way to see what their values are. That's the word he used, values. Said he wants to know if a woman is with him because of who he is or because of what he has. I just stared at him, like, bro, you've been talking about how rich you are for 2 hours, and now you're sprinting a pop quiz on me. The logic didn't even make sense. If anything, it felt like some twisted version of The Bachelor where instead of roses, you get handed a receipt and judged based on your reaction. He said some women get offended and storm out, and he respects that. Others pretend to be cool but reveal themselves later. His words, not mine. And he added, but if you're truly confident in yourself, it doesn't matter who pays. So I just said, sure, and pulled out my card. Not because I agreed with him, but because I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of thinking I cared. The server looked mildly surprised but didn't say anything. We paid. It was silent for a second, and then he tried to pivot back into casual chat like he hadn't just given me a philosophical exam over gnocchi. The rest of the date felt weird. Like the vibe had shifted and now we were both pretending it hadn't. He still smiled the same way, still complimented my earrings, still asked if I wanted to grab dessert somewhere else. I said I had to be up early, which was true but also a lie because I would have stayed out if I hadn't felt like I was just another name on his list of tests. Outside, he offered to walk me in my car. I let him, mostly because it was dark and the area was kind of sketchy. He told me I was different, and I seemed grounded. I nodded, said thanks, and didn't ask what that was supposed to mean. When we got to my car, he leaned in like he wanted to kiss me, but I just gave him the kind of smile people give when they say, maybe next time, but mean nope. I got in, drove off, and halfway home I realized the entire date had been like an unpaid internship with food. One where you get evaluated on your reactions and still have to bring your own pen. I texted my friend the next day and just sent her 3 words. Never again, thanks. She replied with the skull emoji and said, I forgot how weird he is. Yeah, insane. It started weird before it even started. She messaged me before the date asking what kind of cologne I'd be wearing. I thought it was some kind of joke or a really specific allergy, but when I said I didn't usually wear any, she replied, that's fine, natural scent gives off stronger vibes anyway. That should have been the warning, but I shrugged it off because I've been on enough dates to know that people say random stuff sometimes and it doesn't always mean much. We met at this cafe that tries too hard to be quirky. One of those places with chopboard menus and random board games on the shelves like someone's hipster uncle designed it. She picked the spot, and when I got there, she was already sitting at a table by the window with a matcha lot, and her phone propped up next to it, kind of angled toward the chair across from her. I figured she was just watching something, so I sat down and said hi. She smiled big, like over the top big, and then glanced at her phone like she was checking if the lighting was good. Right off the bat, she had this energy that felt like a YouTube intro. Super animated, lots of hand movements, exaggerated reactions to everything I said. I asked her how her day was, and she launched into a story about her neighbor's dog getting stuck in a hoodie, complete with sound effects. I laughed because it was funny, but also because I didn't know what else to do. The whole time she kept sneaking glances at her phone, which by then I realized was still in the same position, still facing me. I asked if she needed to take a call or something, and she said, oh no, it's just recording. I like to keep clips of conversations for inspiration. That's when I started to get a weird feeling. I looked down at the phone, and yeah, it was recording. The screen showed that little red bar and everything. She said she has a TikTok where she talks about modern dating, and that she sometimes uses clips from her dates, not to embarrass anyone, just to break down behaviors. She said it like she was talking about a science project, like we were in a controlled lab environment and it was a mouse sniffing the cheese. I asked if she told the other guy she dated that she was filming, and she gave this half shrug and said, not really, I like to get authentic reactions. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't trying to cause a scene in the middle of a cafe next to a shelf full of Jenga blocks, but I also didn't love the idea that I might be the subject of some online video titled Why Guys Like This Are Red Flags. She noticed I'd gone quiet and laughed, like actually laughed, and said I shouldn't be nervous because I seemed like a good one. That didn't help. We ordered food. She got some vegan wrap with like 6 adjectives in the name, and I just got a sandwich, and I tried to steer the conversation back to normal topics. Music, movies, travel. But everything I said felt like it was being judged in real time, like she was taking mental notes. I asked her what she was into, and she said she liked social experiments, creative analysis, and content that exposes patterns. It sounded more like a TED Talk than a first date. Halfway through eating, she pulled out a notebook and started scribbling in it. I looked at her and she just said, you made a face when I said I don't believe in monogamy. That could be something to unpack later. I honestly didn't even remember making a face. Apparently, I squinted or something. At that point, I started wondering if I was actually on a date or just the unwilling guest star in a video series I didn't subscribe to. She asked me these really specific questions. Stuff like, what's your relationship with vulnerability? And do you think emotional detachment is a strength or a trauma response? I tried to answer the best I could without sounding like a textbook, but it was hard when I kept noticing her phone's red recording light flashing every few seconds. It felt less like a conversation and more like I was auditioning to be the least problematic man she'd ever filmed. The weirdest part was how normal she acted about all of it. Like this was her version of dating. Not even just something she tried once. This was her routine. She told me she'd been doing it for about a year, and that she's learned so much about male behavior. I asked if anyone ever got upset when they found out, and she said, yeah, a couple of guys overreacted and blocked her. Then she added that those guys usually had something to hide anyway. I asked her if she'd be okay being recorded on a date without knowing. She didn't even hesitate. She said she'd love it because then she could analyze herself better. I didn't have anything to say to that. I just nodded and tried to finish my sandwich without thinking about what kind of face I was making. When the check came, she offered to split it, which I was fine with. She asked if I mind rating the date afterward, like a quick review. I thought she was joking, but she pulled out her phone again, opened a notes app, and held it up like an exit interview. I told her I'd give it a solid 5 out of 10, and she wrote that down like it was valuable data. She said she appreciated my honesty, and I seemed self-aware, which apparently is rare. Then she packed up her stuff, adjusted her phone one last time, and said she'd probably do a post about the date later, but wouldn't tag me. Unless I wanted the exposure. I said I was good. Walking out of that cafe, I felt like I'd just been on a date with a documentary filmmaker who forgot to tell me I was part of the documentary. I checked TikTok later that week out of pure paranoia. I didn't see myself on there, but I did find her account. She had a series called Date Dissections with thumbnails that looked like BuzzFeed headlines and clips where she paused the video to point out subtle red flags with captions like, "Watch how he avoids vulnerability here." I didn't follow her, didn't message, didn't comment. Just backed out of the app and ordered a burger, one without commentary. I should have known something was off when he asked me his favorite place in the whole city and sent me an address that led to a youth center attached to a church. At first, I thought maybe he volunteered there or was helping with an event, but when I asked if we should reschedule for somewhere more casual, he replied with, "Trust me, this place has amazing vibes and even better snacks." It wasn't a joke. I got there early just in case, thinking maybe it'd be one of those community spaces that sometimes doubles as a coffee shop or something neutral like that. But no, it was exactly what the address said. Big brick building, cross on the front, 2 kids playing soccer out back, and a plastic signboard out front that said Bible Study Tuesday. Bring your questions. I stood there staring at it while trying not to look like I was waiting for a Tinder date outside a church. Kenny showed up 5 minutes later in a hoodie that said, "God is my plug," and joggers, carrying a Tupperware container of what looked like homemade cookies. He was smiling like I was a long-lost friend, not a girl he met online 4 days ago. He said hi, gave me a side hug, and immediately launched into a story about how he just finished organizing the snack bins for next week's youth retreat. I didn't even get a chance to say anything before he led me inside. The place smelled like crayons and vanilla, which wasn't bad, just unexpected. He waved at literally everyone we passed. It felt like walking through the hometown of someone running for student council. He took me to this little room off the side of the main hallway. It had a small round table with some foldable chairs and a mural of Noah's Ark on the wall. He said it was the parent counseling room, but it had the best lighting for a meal. I asked if there was a reason we weren't going to a restaurant, and he laughed like I was being silly and said, "Why would we pay to eat when we can eat here with purpose?" Then he opened the Tupperware and pulled out 2 sandwiches wrapped in paper towels and a couple of juice boxes. No plates, no utensils, just a very intense PB backslash and J at Capri Sun. I wish I was exaggerating. I figured maybe this was some kind of quirky picnic situation, so I went along with it. We sat down, he passed me a sandwich, and then he said, "Before we eat, let's pray real quick." I've got nothing against praying, but I wasn't expecting to hold hands with a guy I barely knew while he thanked the Lord for this connection and the blessing of future partnership. I opened my eyes for half a second during the prayer and saw he was really asterisk into it. Head bowed, eyes closed, full-blown preacher mode. After the prayer, he looked at me and asked if I wanted to open up with a reflection or two. I didn't even know what that meant, so I said something about being grateful for the weather and tried to steer the convo towards something neutral like TV shows or childhood pets. But Kenny was on another wavelength entirely. He took a bite of his sandwich and said, "I believe the woman I marry will homeschool our kids the way God intended." I almost choked on my juice box straw. He kept going like we were already planning a wedding. He said he doesn't believe in public school because society's values are not kingdom values, and he wants his kids to learn from someone who's anchored in the Word. Apparently, he sees dating as a mission, not just finding a wife, but finding a co-minister in family discipleship. his words. Mine were mostly silence and a lot of internal screaming. At one point he asked if I'd ever taught before. I said no. He said, "That's fine, we'll start with basic scriptures and build from there. God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called." I laughed because I thought he was joking. He was not joking. I tried to shift the energy. Asked him about his job, his hobbies. He said he works in youth mentorship, which I think meant he was a part-time camp leader and helped organize church lock-ins. As for hobbies, he said he makes Christian rap and is currently recording a mixtape called Saved But Savage. I nodded like that was a normal sentence and bit into the driest sandwich I've ever tasted in my life. Midway through the date, a teenager peeked into the room and said, "Hey, Kenny, you got time to pray with us?" He told the kid to give him 10 minutes and then turned to me with a proud smile like, "See, ministry never stops." That's when he leaned forward and said something that still doesn't feel real. "I can see us raising warriors for Crest. Have you thought about what kind of curriculum you want to use?" That was when I realized this wasn't a date. This was a recruitment pitch. I told him I didn't really see homeschooling in my future and that I probably wasn't the right person for that lifestyle. He blinked at me like I just admitted I kicked puppies for fun. And he asked if I'd at least be open to starting small, like helping lead Sunday school together, or maybe co-hosting a purity workshop. I said I'd have to think about it. By think about it, I meant leave immediately. I checked the time and said I had to head out early, made up some excuse about my roommate being locked out or something. He looked disappointed, but handed me one of the cookies from his container and said, "At least take this. It's double anointed." I took the cookie and thanked him even though I was 90% sure it was just a regular chocolate chip with maybe some cinnamon thrown in. As I was walking out, he shouted down the hallway, "Text me if the spirit moves you." I gave him a thumbs up, got in my car, and drove straight to the nearest gas station to buy an actual meal and some emotional clarity. The cookie was dry, like painfully dry. No spirit moved. No texts were sent. And I still don't know what curriculum he was talking about. The first thing she said to me in person was that I looked exactly like a guy she used to date, but less emotionally constipated. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a preemptive dig, but she was already laughing before I could respond, so I just smiled and tried to take it in stride. Her name was Haley, and we met at this little art-themed cafe where all the tables had paint splatters sealed under resin and the chairs looked like they were stolen from a press school, but painted black to seem edgy. The whole place felt like it was trying very hard to be different, which kind of matched her energy perfectly. She had this wild, curly hair tied up with a pen stuck in it like a hair stick, and she wore this oversized hoodie with a graphic of a bleeding cartoon heart that said, "Love is a scam" under it. She had rings on almost every finger and a chipped manicure that she seemed weirdly proud of. Before I even sat down, she was already telling me about how she'd just been to a thrift store where she found a box of old divorce papers and wanted to turn them into a college. I laughed, assuming she was joking. She wasn't. We ordered food. She got a lavender latte and a plate of sweet potato fries. I got a coffee and a sandwich I regretted the second I saw it. And we started talking about normal stuff at first. Movies, music, how people who say, "I don't watch TV" are lying. She had a way of talking where everything felt like part of the story she'd already told before, but not in a bad way. More like her life was a long performance art piece and you were just stepping into a scene halfway through. 20 minutes in, she suddenly leaned forward like she was about to tell me a secret. I thought it was going to be something dramatic like she used to be in a cult or she'd once been on a reality show. Instead, she said, "So just so you're aware, I document all my relationships." I raised an eyebrow, kind of amused, and asked what she meant. She reached into her tote bag, pulled out this thick binder with stickers all over it, and slid it across the table like it was completely normal. It said, "The Ex-Boyfriend Scrapbook" in puffy letter stickers across the front. I didn't open it. She opened it. Inside were what looked like printed out texts, photos, ticket stubs, sketches, handwritten notes, even a page that had been burned around the edges for dramatic effect. Each guy had a section. I saw one labeled Lamb, a liar, another called Trevor, almost perfect. She flipped through them like she was showing me a portfolio of her greatest hits. She said it started as a way to process grief creatively, but now it was kind of a tradition. Every relationship she's had for the last 4 years got a spot in the scrapbook. I asked her if they knew about it. She said some did, some didn't, but that it wasn't about them. It was her emotional museum, and if people didn't want to be part of it, they shouldn't have dated her. I was halfway through trying to decide if this was genius or completely unhinged when she gave me with a real twist. I hope you're cool with being part of it eventually, she said, sipping her latte like she hadn't just casually told me I'd be immortalized in a breakup archive. I laughed, thinking again that she was messing with me. She wasn't. She said she doesn't date casually. Every guy she dates has to agree to be included in the scrapbook if things end. It's part of the process. She doesn't ask for much, just one final conversation where she has to ask questions, take a Polaroid, and maybe get a copy of a playlist they shared or a memory she can turn into a page. She said it helps her move on and also helps her followers. I asked her what she meant by followers. Turns out she posts about the scrapbook online. Not all of it, just parts, like the covers she makes or the art she creates from the breakup energy. She said people message her for advice and inspiration, and one girl even used her format to make her own version. Haley called it empowering. I called it a little intense, but again, she wasn't even flinching. This was clearly normal to her. The more she talked, the clearer it became that she wasn't joking, wasn't unstable, just fully committed to her weird little project. She told me about one guy who gave her an old hoodie to include after they split, another who wrote her a breakup letter on lined notebook paper that she turned into a college. She said one guy even tried to get her to take his page out after he got engaged, but she refused. You can't erase history, she said, like she was curating a museum of failed intimacy. I tried to steer the convo back to lighter stuff, asked her about music again, but she brought it right back to the scrapbook. She said she already had ideas for my page, just in case. Said I've seemed like someone who'd have a clean aesthetic, maybe neutral tones, maybe something poetic and slightly tragic. I didn't know whether to laugh or run. I kind of did both mentally. We wrapped up the date not long after. She walked me to my car and hugged me like we'd known each other for years. Said she had a good feeling about this one. I said, cool, because what else was I supposed to say? She waved goodbye with her fingers wiggling like she was casting a spell, and then walked off down the street with the scrapbook tucked under her arm like a weapon. On the way home, I kept thinking about that binder. I couldn't stop picturing it sitting on a shelf with other binders just like it. Each one labeled with some nickname or symbol that made sense only to her. I imagined my name on one. I imagined a picture of me taped next to a quote I didn't remember saying, a dried flower, maybe a bus ticket. Something ordinary turned dramatic. It was funny. It was creepy. It was kind of brilliant. I never saw her again. She texted me once asking what my favorite breakup song was and if I believed in closure. I didn't answer, but part of me still wonders if I made the scrapbook anyway. If there's a page with my face on it, stuck next to a caption that says, Ben, didn't get it. I met him at a food truck park. You know, one of those trendy spots where every meal comes in a cardboard boat and people pretend to enjoy eating standing up. My friend dragged me out after a bad week and said I needed to recalibrate my dating standards, which was rich coming from someone who once dated a guy because his Spotify playlists were mysteriously sad. Anyway, I was standing in line for some overpriced fusion tacos when this guy, nicknamed Chunks, real name never confirmed, started chatting with me. He was tall, loud, and way too confident for someone wearing joggers with built-in knee pads. He said he liked my vibes, said I looked like someone who could birth legends. That was the first sentence out of his mouth. Not hi, not what's your name. That I laughed because what else do you do when someone basically calls your uterus heroic before even offering to buy you lunch? He followed me to the seating area with a tray of wings that smelled amazing, and we ended up sharing a picnic table next to a guy trying to impress his date with card tricks. Chunks asked if I was on the apps, and when I said kind of, he immediately launched into a speech about how dating apps are contaminated by people with bad DNA and no goals. He said he only goes on dates with women who pass a specific set of criteria, which sounded intense, but whatever, it was a nice afternoon and the wings were good. We talked about random stuff, his love of protein smoothies, my inability to parallel park, why no one reads cereal boxes anymore. Then he dropped it. Mid-bite, mid-conversation, he looked me dead in the eye and said, so before we go any further, I'll need to see your medical records. I laughed. Not the polite kind, either. The confused kind, where you're waiting for the punchline that never comes. He didn't blink, didn't smile. Just stared at me like this was the most reasonable thing in the world. I thought maybe he meant it as a joke, so I played along for a second and said, "What, like allergies or something?" And he shook his head and said, "Fertility stuff. You know, reproductive history, hormone levels, genetic markers, that kind of thing." I sat there holding a taco I no longer wanted, trying to figure out if I was being pranked. He took out his phone, opened some kind of spreadsheet app, and said he had a system. A legit system. He tracks compatibility factors. Said he made it after his last almost baby situation. And now he doesn't date anyone unless they score at least an 8 on what he called his FCP scale. I asked what that meant, and he said, fertility compatibility potential. I couldn't make this up if I tried. He explained it like he was presenting at a business conference. Apparently, he wants 3 kids minimum, wants them naturally, has a preference for strong immune systems and symmetrical features. He said he doesn't believe in wasting time with women who don't want to optimize. That was his word. Optimize. Like people are math problems or salad bars. Then he pulled out a folder from his backpack, at which I was kidding. Inside were printed charts, references from articles I didn't ask for, and a blank form that I guess I was supposed to fill out. He said he didn't need anything super detailed right away, just some basic facts. Birth control history, family diseases, hormone regulation, menstrual regularity, and any vitamin deficiencies. He said if I didn't have a current physical, he knew a clinic that offered efficient testing and could expedite the process. I was frozen, like actually stunned into silence. He took my lack of response as interest and started talking about how his future wife will need to maintain a preconception fitness plan to ensure optimal pregnancy outcomes. He even mentioned postnatal bonding strategies like we were already negotiating a shared Google Calendar. At one point, he asked if I had ever done a DNA heritage test, and when I said no, he nodded like that was a problem. Said it was step 1 and asked if I'd be open to doing it before a second date. I told him this was way too much, way too fast, and he looked genuinely confused. He said he was just being honest about his standards, and that most women appreciate the transparency. He said too many people date for vibes and not enough for viability. Then he asked if I even wanted kids, and when I said maybe, someday, he looked at me like I'd just confessed to a crime. He'd all quiet after that and started eating again like nothing had happened. Like we hadn't just taken a nosedive into medical records and hypothetical childbirth. I sat there thinking about how I'd ended up at a picnic table with a guy who treats dating like a fertility audition. Eventually, I stood up and told him I had to meet a friend. He asked if I'd take the folder with me and just think about it. I left it on the table. As I was walking away, he called out, "If you change your mind, let me know. Your facial symmetry is a solid 9, by the way." I didn't turn around. Just kept walking until I was out of range, then ducked behind a smoothie truck to make sure he wasn't following me. He wasn't. I told my friend later that night, and she nearly dropped her drink. She asked if I was mad. I wasn't, just baffled. I kept picturing that folder, how prepared he was, how serious he seemed. Like he really thought this was normal. Like everyone just rolls up to dates with spreadsheets and an agenda. I blocked his number, obviously, but sometimes I still think about what my FCV score would have been. Not because I care, just because I'm almost sure he calculated it anyway. She showed up late, which didn't bother me at first because the bar was cool and I had a decent spot near the back, just far enough from the speakers to actually hear things. But she didn't apologize when she walked in. She just kind of strolled up like we'd been sitting together this whole time, dropped her bag on the chair, and said, "I'm in a mood, hope that's okay." And I said sure, even though I had no idea what kind of mood she meant. Ashlyn had this whole vibe like she was daring someone to challenge her. Messy eyeliner that looked amazing on her but would have made me look like I got hit by a glitter truck. Hair clipped up with 2 strands falling perfectly out of place. Big black boots, short skirt, oversized hoodie that probably belonged to a brother or an ex or maybe some guy she ghosted. She sat down, flagged the bartender over with a snap, and ordered a shot of mezcal and a beer back like it was part of her daily vitamin intake. I asked how her day was, and she launched straight into a rant about how men are the reason society is collapsing. No seg, no build up. Just men are the reason society is collapsing, and nobody wants to talk about it because everyone's either part of the problem or too scared to be honest. I nodded slowly and asked what specifically she meant, thinking maybe this was about some recent headline or a bad interaction. She waved her hand like that was irrelevant and said it was everything. Capitalism, climate change, mental health, dating apps, TikTok, the way men breathe. She wasn't joking either. She said it like she'd been waiting all week to unleash it on someone, and I just happened to be the one with a face and open seat across from her. I kept sipping my drink and listening because, weirdly enough, she was engaging. Even when she was yelling about how men treat emotional intelligence like it's a rare Pokemon card, she still made some points. I didn't agree with all of it, but I could tell she actually believed what she was saying. At one point, she'd asked if I'd ever cried in front of a woman and then interrupted me before I could answer to say, wait, no, real crying. Like ugly crying. Not the movie tear you wipe away to seem deep. I said yes once, and she stared at me for a second like she was trying to decide if I was lying or just emotionally repressed. Then she nodded and said, cool. You're one of the tolerables. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment, but it felt like one coming from her. We ordered more drinks. She switched to bourbon. I stuck with beer. The longer we talked, the more she loosened up, not in a giggly way, but in the I've got so many thoughts and not enough time kind of way. She went off about office culture, therapy culture, hookup culture. Said everything was broken and most people were too busy doom scrolling to notice. I asked if she believed anything could actually get better, and she said no, not really, but you have to live like it might. I didn't fully understand that, but I wrote it down in my brain because it sounded like something a poet would say during a nervous breakdown. She told me about this guy she used to date who said women were too sensitive now, and how she spent 2 months trying to prove him wrong before realizing he just hated women and liked podcasts. She told me about a Tinder match who invited her to a hot yoga class, and then coasted her because she didn't own Lululemon. And she told me about how her best friend thinks she's too much, but that being less never worked out for her either, so she gave up on being digestible. And just when I thought the night was winding down, when I was about to pay and call it a pretty intense but oddly interesting evening, she leaned in, looked me dead in the eye, and said, so, do you want to come back to mine? I blinked, not because I was shocked she asked, but because she asked it right after telling me that all romantic connection is a scam invented by the patriarchy. 5 seconds earlier, she was railing against the idea of nuclear families, and now she was inviting me into her bed like this was a rom-com. I didn't even get a chance to answer before she added, it's not emotional, it's practical. I sleep better next to someone I like the way you exist. That line hit me in the weirdest way. I like the way you exist. Who even says that? I said sure, partly because I was curious, and partly because she had this gravity that made saying no feel like stepping out of a movie mid-scene. We took a cab to her place, a small, cluttered apartment filled with plants that all looked like they were dying beautifully. There were books everywhere, half-burned candles, a pile of jackets that probably had stories attached to them, and a whiteboard near the fridge that said, nothing matters. Fry anyway. She made tea, offered me a hoodie, and started putting on music that sounded like it was recorded in a haunted tunnel. And she asked me about my parents. Just like that. No lead-in. I told her what she wanted to know, and she listened without interrupting, which was shocking given how much she talked earlier. Then she told me about hers. Said they used to fight so much she can't enjoy the sound of dishes clinking. Said her dad cried once when she was 10, and it scared her more than any yelling ever did. Then she said, that's why I talk too much. Silence feels like a warning. Later, when we were sitting on the floor because her couch was covered in art supplies, she asked if I'd ever fallen in love. I said I wasn't sure. She nodded like that made sense. Said she didn't believe in love in the traditional way, but she believed in moments. Good moments count for something, even if they don't build anything permanent. Then she offered me a pillow and curled up next to me like it was the most normal thing in the world. We didn't kiss. Didn't even touch beyond her shoulder brushing mine. She just talked until she got tired. Music about the moon, though, how people ruin each other without meaning to. Then she fell asleep, and I just sat there for a while, staring at a poster on her wall that said, feel everything, then burn it. I left around 3 a.m. quietly, like slipping out of a weird dream I didn't totally want to wake up from. She didn't text the next day. I didn't either. But every now and then I hear a sentence in my head that sounds like her and wonder if she still makes tea for strangers she pulls into her orbit just long enough to say something unforgettable. We met at a rooftop bar downtown where all the drinks were $16 and every guy had a fade and a chain. Pete didn't look like the type who belonged there, but he walked in like he owned it anyway. Tan corduroy jacket, tight jeans, loafers with no socks, and a smirk that made me feel like I was already being judged. He greeted me with a "hey trouble," which made my brain immediately short circuit because who actually says that out loud? I wasn't expecting much, honestly. We'd matched on a dating app after he sent a message that said, "You seem like someone who's tired of boring men." That was the kind of thing that usually made me swipe left, but he had this weird charisma in his photos. Like too much charisma. Like someone who practices facial expressions in front of the mirror and names his playlists things like mood, unbothered. So I was curious. Dangerous kind of curious. He didn't ask me a single question for the first 10 minutes. Not one. He just launched into this story about how he once got kicked out of a bar in Spain for being too smooth with the bartender. I asked what that meant, and he said she couldn't handle my energy. Then he grinned like he just dropped the punchline of a TED Talk. I sipped my drink and nodded, trying to decide if I was talking to a cartoon or a real person. He talked a lot about his past, not in a deep way, more like he was trying to show me his highlight reel. Told me he used to be a pickup artist. Said it in the same tone someone might use to say they used to play high school football. Casual, almost proud. I laughed thinking he was messing with me, but no, he meant it. He said he used to run workshops and everything. Not the sleazy kind, he added, like that made it better. He said it was about confidence and strategy, helping guys become high-value men. I asked if that included negging, and he smiled like I caught him cheating on a test. Well, yeah, that was part of it, but it was more nuance. Right after saying that, he looked at my drink, then back at me, and went, you'd actually seem more grounded if you ordered something less flashy. I stared at him because what the hell kind of feedback is that? He said it with the tone of a life coach giving a TEX talk titled, "Why Your Cocktail Choice Reflects Your Emotional Availability." I asked if he just negged me, and he said, "It's not negging if it's true." Then he winked. I should have left then, honestly, but part of me wanted to see how deep the rabbit hole went. It was like watching a car do donuts in a parking lot. You know it's not going anywhere good, but it's hard to look away. Pete started breaking down our chemistry like he was analyzing sports footage. Told me we had a bit of a challenge dynamic, that was probably high self-esteem but secretly validation seeking, and that he could work with that. I asked him if this was how he talks to everyone, and he said, "Only the ones I'm interested in. You've got potential." Like I was an investment opportunity. He dropped that he'd been sued once by a girl who claimed he manipulated her emotionally during a retreat he hosted. He called it a misunderstanding, and said he's more careful now. Said he doesn't run the retreats anymore, but he still coaches guys on dating, just more ethically. I asked what ethically meant to him, and he said, "It's about consent and clarity. If they know what they're signing up for, it's all fair game." Then he leaned in, lowered his voice, and said, "I can tell you're the kind of woman who's hard to impress, but I'm not here to impress you. I'm here to see if you're interesting enough for me." That's when I realized he wasn't even being cocky in the fun, playful way. This was his baseline. This was his personality. We ordered another round, and he told me more about his philosophy. Said dating is a game, and anyone who pretends otherwise is lying to themselves. He compared it to chess, said most people are playing checkers. I asked him what happens when he actually likes someone, and he said, "Then I play harder. That's when it gets fun." I asked if he was ever in love, and he shrugged. Said love is just a neurochemical imbalance, and that people chase it because they've been sold a fantasy. He said if you strip it down, it's all about biology and timing. Then he asked if I wanted to get out of there and continue the conversation somewhere more honest. I told him no thanks. He raised an eyebrow and said, "That's cool. Resistance is just part of the pattern." I didn't even reply. I just asked for the check, paid for my own drink, and stood up. He didn't look mad. He just looked smug, like he was filing the whole interaction away in some mental database labeled power moves. As I walked out, he called after me, "Text me if you ever want to see behind the curtain." I didn't turn around. I went home and deleted the app the next morning, not out of bitterness, but because I realized I needed a break. Not from dating exactly, just from people who treat it like a sport. From guys who look at connection like it's a puzzle they're trying to solve so they can win something. I wasn't trying to be one. I was just trying to have a nice drink with someone who didn't try to downgrade me for ordering tequila with a flower in it. That's the thing about people like Pete. They think they're the ones in control because they read a bunch of books and memorize tricks. But it's not charm if it leaves you feeling smaller. It's just noise in a nicer outfit. She had a clipboard when she walked in, not in a casual, tucked under the arm way, but out in the open in her hand, like she was late to a strategy meeting. We were at this Italian spot I'd never been to, the kind with dim lights and overpriced ravioli and tiny tables shoved way too close together. I stood up to say hi, and she shook my hand like I was interviewing for a job. The clipboard sat right there in her other hand while we sat down, like it had its own seat at the table. At first, I thought maybe she was in real estate or wedding planning or something, some career where you have to carry around checklists and forms. But the second we sat down, she said, "So before we dive into anything, I want to be super clear that I date with intention." I said, "Okay, sure," and she smiled like I'd passed the first test. Then she slid the clipboard toward me. It had a printed document clipped on top. Title in bold, Relationship Expectations and Timeline Agreement. I blinked. She told me not to worry, that it wasn't a contract exactly, just a framework for mutual understanding. She used that exact phrase. I tried to laugh it off, assuming this was some kind of quirky icebreaker or social experiment, but she was completely serious. She pulled a pen out of her purse, set it on the table between us, and said, "Feel free to read it over during appetizers." I looked down at it, and yeah, it was a real document. Bullet points, checkboxes, signature lines. There were sections labeled non-negotiables, communication style preferences, financial expectations, and my personal favorite, projected engagement window. She had a little note under that one that said, "Ideally within 6 months. Extensions negotiable but discouraged." I asked if she brought one of these to every date, and she nodded like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Said she doesn't believe in wasting time. If a man isn't ready to commit within half a year, then he's probably not serious. I asked what happens if someone refuses to sign it. She said that's actually helpful because it tells her they're not aligned, and she can move on without emotional investment. That phrase again, emotional investment, like love was a startup, and she was pitching for funding. We hadn't even ordered drinks yet. A server came by, probably sensing my panic energy, and we ordered a bottle of wine because I needed something in my hand that wasn't a pen about to be used on a binding emotional document. She asked if I had any questions about the form while we waited, and I asked if she'd ever actually had someone sign it. She said yes twice. One guy lasted 4 months before deviating from the agreement. The other made it to 7 before getting cold feet and requesting a renegotiation. She spoke like she was describing mergers, not breakups, and while she talked, she pulled out her phone and opened a spreadsheet. I only saw it for a second, but it had tabs labeled with names and dates and phrases like milestone met and exit reason. I think she saw my expression because she smiled and said, "Transparency is attractive, right?" I told her I'd never met anyone like her. She said thank you and wrote that down. I'm not kidding. She had a notes app open and just typed it in. Then she asked what my long-term goals were in the categories of romance, finance, and spirituality. She even paused after each one to give me time to think, like we were doing speed therapy. I gave the safest answers I could: stability, partnership, growth, because I honestly wasn't trying to get kicked out of a date I hadn't even gotten breadsticks on yet. We finally got food. I was hoping she'd relax a little once she had something to chew on. Nope. She pulled out a second page from the clipboard. This one was a compatibility quiz. Multiple choice. Had stuff like in a disagreement I prefer, A, silent reflection, B, immediate resolution, C, space to cool down, D, none of the above. I said I didn't think I could do a quiz right now. She asked if I preferred paper or digital, and I offered to email me a version instead. I stared at her and said, "Do you ever just hang out and see if you like someone?" She tilted her head and said, "That's inefficient." That was a word that stuck with me. Inefficient. I asked if she was afraid of being surprised, of maybe liking someone who didn't fit all the boxes. She shook her head and said that's how people end up wasting years with the wrong person. And she asked if I wanted kids. I said I wasn't sure yet. She frowned, made a note, and moved to the next question like I was a contestant, and I just lost a few points. After dinner, she asked if I wanted to walk for a bit. I was so overwhelmed I said yes just to buy myself time to process. We walked down this quiet block with twinkle lights hanging from the trees, and she asked if I'd be open to a second date where we could dive into our family histories. She said unresolved parental trauma is one of the leading causes of relationship dysfunction, and she likes to get ahead of it. I told her I needed time to think about everything. She said, of course, that reflection is vital, and asked if she could send me a calendar invite for a follow-up conversation. Not a date, just a check-in. I said I'd text her, and she said, texting is prone to misinterpretation. Voice memo is preferred. I got home and just sat on my couch staring at nothing for a while. Her clipboard had somehow made it into my thoughts like a character in a horror movie. The pen, the spreadsheet, the projected engagement window. I wasn't even mad. I was just stunned. She texted me the next morning. A long voice memo explaining how she appreciated my neutral but open energy and hoped I'd take time to assess potential alignment. She ended it with, "If this isn't your journey, I still wish you peace and productive partnerships." I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. It wasn't even that she had a contract. It was how sure she was that this was the right way to find love, like she'd outsmarted the whole system. Maybe she had in her own way, but I guess I still want to believe in mess, in unpredictability, in just sitting across from someone without a form to fill out, wondering who they might turn into, not what they might propose. It started out pretty normal. Just drinks at a new bar that had one of those pretentious names that sounds like a tech startup. Brian. I showed it a little early, grabbed a seat near the back, and tried not to judge the fact that every cocktail on the menu had at least 3 ingredients I couldn't pronounce. He showed up on time, which already put him above the usual, and he looked like his pictures, which was rare enough to feel like a win. Tallish, clean cut were one of those jackets that guys wear when they want to look effortlessly successful, but not try hard. He smiled, sat down, and the first 10 minutes were fine. He talked a little fast, but had good energy. Funny, even. Said he worked in marketing, used to play soccer, hated networking events. We bonded over how LinkedIn feels like a digital hostage situation and how group chats are the real family now. It was all pretty smooth until I noticed him adjusting his phone on the table. Not just checking it, but turning it slightly, moving a coaster under it, tilting the screen toward us like he was trying to get the angle just right. I didn't say anything at first. Maybe he was waiting for a text or using one of those calorie tracking apps that listens to your chewing or something. But then he reached across, tapped the screen, and I saw it, a little red dot in the corner. His phone was recording, video recording. I blinked at it, then looked at him and said, "Is your phone filming?" And he didn't flinch. Just nodded and said, "Yeah, I always record my dates, for safety." I laughed and he had to be kidding. He wasn't. He said it calmly like it was no big deal. Told me it wasn't personal, that he records all his dates and has been doing it for over a year now. He said it gives him peace of mind and protects him from false narratives. I asked if he ever asked people before hitting record, and he said, "Well, it's a public space. Legally, I don't need permission." Like that made it okay. I sat there, one halfway in my mouth, trying to decide if I should be creeped out or impressed by his nerve. I asked what he did with the recordings, and he said he usually deletes them after a week unless something weird happens. Then he shrugged and added, "Or if it's a particularly good convo. I like to study patterns and how people connect." That was when I realized I wasn't on a date. I was on an unpaid social experiment. He leaned back, totally relaxed, and said he'd started doing it after a woman once accused him of being manipulative. He didn't go into detail about what that meant, just said it had been a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, and that ever since, he documents everything. Said he's big on data integrity, which made him sound less like a romantic and more like a detective who dabbles in dating. I asked him if anyone had ever walked out over it. He said a few had, but most people either didn't notice or eventually saw the logic. That word, logic, got under my skin. Like this was just a logical decision, like recording people without their knowledge in intimate settings wasn't deeply weird. He even smiled when he said it, like he expected me to be impressed by how proactive he was. The bartender came over and asked if we wanted another round. I said no, not yet, and Derek, I'm assuming that was still his real name, used the time to adjust his phone again. That was when I saw a second app open behind the camera. Some kind of transcription software. He was recording audio and generating real-time captions. I asked, "What is that for?" And he said, "Sometimes I like to analyze tone and phrasing. It helps me see where conversations go wrong or get derailed." I must have been visibly stunned because he followed it up with, "Don't worry, I don't post this anywhere. It's private. Purely for insight." I asked if he'd ever considered journaling instead. He laughed and said that wouldn't be objective. He said the recordings had actually helped him become a better communicator. He gave an example about how he used to interrupt people too much and didn't even realize it until he watched himself back. "It's like game tape," he said. "Every good athlete studies their performance." At this point, I couldn't tell if he was a genius or just deeply committed to being unsettling. The worst part was that he wasn't outwardly creepy. He wasn't sleazy or pushy. He didn't hit on me weirdly or say anything outright offensive. But there was this coldness under it all, like he was observing the date instead of participating in it, like he was watching it in his head in real time, scoring points, noting trends, planning feedback for later. Eventually, I told him I didn't feel comfortable being recorded and asked him to turn it off. He hesitated, then said, "If it makes you uncomfortable, I'll delete the file right now." But he didn't offer to stop recording future dates. Didn't see the problem. To him, I was just someone who didn't fully understand the benefits of accountability. I finished my drink quickly, stood up, and said I had to leave. He offered to walk me to my car, and I said no thanks. As I walked away, he called out, "Let me know if you change your mind. You were a really good conversationalist." It was such a strange thing to hear after being treated like a case study. The next day, he sent a voice memo, not a text, a full-on audio message, saying he appreciated how honest I'd been and that if I ever wanted to talk off the record, he'd be open to it. He actually said off the record, like we were journalists or spies or something. I didn't reply. I blocked his number. But for a while after, I kept thinking about how many other people he'd recorded. How many conversations he had stored somewhere, even for just a week. I wondered if anyone ever saw the files, if he ever watched them back for comfort or control or curiosity. Or if he really did delete them like he said. Whatever his reason, one thing was clear. That guy didn't want a connection. He wanted a case file. And it wasn't about to be someone's data point, no matter how good the wine was. She picked the spot, some cocktail lounge with soft lighting and velvet chairs that looked like they belonged in an old movie theater. The kind of place where the menu doesn't list prices and the bartender wears suspenders for aesthetic. I showed up 5 minutes early, and she was already there scrolling through her phone like she was grading papers. She looked up when I approached and gave me a quick smile, the kind that doesn't really reach your eyes. It felt more like a checkmark than a greeting. She looked incredible, though, I won't lie. One of those people who just radiate confidence, like they'd never trip over a sidewalk crack in their life. Hairstyle, outfit coordinated like it was selected by an app. She stood to greet me and sat back down just as fast, immediately adjusting her chair so she was facing the room, not me. I took that as my first warning. We started with drinks. I ordered something safe. She got a drink with 5 ingredients and made a point to ask if they used the good tequila. The server nodded like he'd been asked that question by her before, and that's when I realized she was probably a regular here. We got into basic small talk, or from what we do, the usual surface level fluff. I told her I worked in design and she nodded politely, then asked how much I make. Just like that. Like she was asking if I preferred dogs or cats. I paused, thinking she was joking, but she raised an eyebrow like I was stalling. I gave her a vague answer and she smiled, a little too knowingly. That was when she pulled her phone out again and said, "I just want to be transparent. I do have certain financial standards when it comes to dating." She said it so casually, like it was a dietary preference. Gluten-free, pescatarian, financially selective. I asked what that meant exactly, and she launched into this whole explanation. Said she believes relationships work better when both people are financially compatible, and for her that means a specific lifestyle, specific goals, and yes, a minimum income bracket. I said okay, and then she said, "So what's your credit score?" I laughed. She didn't. She repeated the question. Said she didn't need the exact number, just a general range. explained that she uses it as a way to gauge how someone manages their life. Money reflects values, she said, and values are everything. I asked if she always brought this up on first dates, and she said, not always, only if there's potential, which somehow made it worse. I asked her if this was about avoiding gold diggers or something, trying to understand where she was coming from. She shook her head and said, no, it's about efficiency. I don't have time to build with someone who's financially chaotic. She had these phrases like she was reading from a script. Financially chaotic, stability signaling, growth trajectory. It felt like I was sitting across from a business consultant, not a date. She told me about her ex, a guy who didn't believe in credit cards and kept his money in cash for freedom. She said he was sweet but economically misaligned, and she couldn't let herself go through that again. Said dating for love is great in theory, but she's done being the realistic one in a relationship. I asked if she'd ever dated someone who made less money than her, and she made a face like I asked if she'd ever eaten cat food. She launched into a rant about how people pretend money doesn't matter when really it affects everything: housing, travel, kids, even the kind of friends you have. And while some of what she said wasn't wrong, the delivery was so cold it made it hard to agree with her. It wasn't even that she had standards. It was the way she treated them like the only thing that mattered. Like personality, kindness, humor, those were bonuses. But credit, health, that was the main course. Then she asked if I rented or owned. I told her I rented, and she nodded like she was mentally lowering my score. I asked if she owned, and she said not yet. But she'd been pre-approved and was just waiting for interest rates to cool off. I nodded and tried to change the subject. Asked what kind of movies she liked. She said she didn't really watch movies because they're not productive. Said she preferred podcasts about finance and negotiation, sometimes true crime, but only if the production quality was high. I asked if she ever just relaxed. She said, that is relaxing. Halfway through the date, she asked if I'd be open to a financial planning session together. Not now, but in general, like on a second or a third date. Said it could be a fun bonding experience. I asked if that's something she actually does with people, and she said yes. Once dated a guy who let her build his entire investment portfolio by date 4. I asked if they were still together. She said no, he had entrepreneur energy with no follow-through. The server brought the check, and before I could say anything, she grabbed it, looked it over, and said, I think it makes sense for us to split. I was fine with that, but it was the way she said it, like we were dividing costs on a business lunch, not finishing a date. She Venmo requested me before we even stood up. Not kidding. She had the app open and typed in the amount like it was second nature. Outside, she offered me a very polite hug, said she had a good time and would circle back once she had time to review the vibes. I wasn't even mad. I just stood there in front of the glowing restaurant sign, watching her walk away in her heels like she was heading to a board meeting that didn't even know it was happening. She texted the next morning and said she appreciated my transparency, but felt we were misaligned on key lifestyle factors. Then she wished me success in all my emotional and financial goals. I stared at the message for a long time, unsure if I'd just been coasted or politely off-boarded. And honestly, I wasn't even mad. She was consistent. Intense, but consistent. I just didn't know there were people out here treating dating like Shark Tank. Like you're supposed to walk in with a pitch, a portfolio, and a 5-year plan. I came in with vibes. She came in with a calculator. Guess that's the market now. The first red flag didn't even wave, it strutted. We agreed to meet at a little family-owned diner for brunch, which seemed low-key and safe. The kind of place with cracked leather boots and syrup bottles that stick to your hands no matter how many napkins you use. I got there a couple minutes early, grabbed a booth by the window, and texted him to say I was there. He replied, coming in now, look for 2 of us. I assumed he meant he was bringing a friend to say hi or maybe had some kind of dog with him, which would have honestly been a win. But no, he walked in with his mom. Like, actually his mom. She was wearing this pink cardigan that had the kind of stiff bob haircut that hasn't changed since 2003. She smiled like we were at a wedding reception and said, you must be the girl. I stood up, completely thrown, and Jake introduced her like it was the most natural thing ever. This is my mom. She just wanted to come meet you. She's my vetting partner. His words, not you paraphrasing. I honestly thought I was being pranked. I looked around like maybe someone was filming us. Nope, real life. We sat down, the three of us, and she immediately took charge of the conversation. Asked if I'd been raised religious, what my relationship with my parents was like, and whether I believed in spanking children. I was still holding the laminated menu, trying to decide between pancakes and running out the door, while she was out here conducting a full-blown interview. Jake just nodded along like this was a group project, and she was the designated presenter. He chimed in once to say that his mom has great instincts, especially when it comes to women. I asked how often she comes on his dates, and he said not all of them, just the serious prospects. I had no idea what qualified me as a serious prospect. I asked him, and he said I gave off wife energy in my profile. I blinked. Twice. The waitress came to take our order, visibly confused about the setup, and Jake's mom ordered for all of us. Just straight up said, she'll have the omelet, he'll do the French toast, and I'll take the waffle combo. I opened my mouth to object, and then just let it happen. At that point, it felt like I was in a simulation and resisting would break the code. She turned back to me and asked what I envisioned for my future family. They all want kids. How many? Was I open to staying home with them? Did I believe in homeschooling? And if not, how did I plan to protect them from the culture? I was sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee and trying not to short circuit. Jake sat there smiling like this was all going incredibly well. Every time his mom asked something, he glanced over to see how I was reacting, like he was mentally scoring my answers. I asked, is this a regular thing for you guys? And she said, we're very close. I helped him avoid a lot of heartbreak. And she winked. She actually winked. Jake leaned in and said, a lot of women are intimidated by strong family ties. I can already tell you're different. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a warning. The food came, and she started cutting Jake's French toast for him. I square on everything. She was slicing it into little squares while explaining how important it is for a woman to support her man in every season of life. Jake just nodded like this was a TED Talk and not complete madness. I finally asked how long he's been doing this, bringing his mom to dates. He said it started after a messy breakup a couple years ago when he ignored her gut feeling and dated someone who didn't like family holidays. Ever since, he's made it a rule that his mom meets anyone he's seriously considering. First or second date, depending on the vibe. Sometimes third if they need to warm up first. I asked if his dad was involved in this process, and he said no. His dad thinks it's a little intense. That was the most relatable thing I'd heard all morning. Halfway through the meal, his mom pulled out a little notebook and started writing things down. I asked what she was doing, and she said she likes to journal the process. She called it a discernment log. I didn't ask to see it because I honestly didn't want to know what category she was filing me into. Jake asked me what I look for in a husband. Not a partner, not a boyfriend. A husband. I tried to give a vague answer about wanting someone kind and supportive, and his mom jumped in with, would you be willing to take his last name immediately after engagement? Immediately, not marriage. Engagement. I said that felt a little fast, and she frowned and wrote something else down in the notebook. Jake didn't say much, just took another bite of toast and gave me a look like, hey, just roll with it. Like this was a test I had to pass to earn the privilege of dating him. The check came and Jake's mom grabbed it before either of us could move. She insisted. Said it was her treat, like we just sat through a timeshare presentation. I tried to argue, but she waved me off and said, if this goes well, we'll consider it an investment. I nearly choked on my water. They walked me out to my car and Jake asked if I'd want to go out again. Maybe just the two of us. His mom added, I think this was a very productive meeting. You're clearly smart and grounded. Jake smiled and said, see, I told you she liked you. I said I'd think about it, got in my car, and drove straight to a grocery store to walk around aimlessly and process what had just happened. I called my best friend, and she didn't believe me until I sent her a selfie I'd taken in the bathroom mid-date, with Jake's mom's reflection barely visible in the mirror behind me. He texted the next day to follow up. Said he felt like we had alignment potential and asked if I'd be open to meeting his cousins next. I didn't reply. Because here's the thing, family is great. Close bonds are sweet, but if your mom's cutting your French toast and taking notes while grilling your date about homeschooling philosophies, maybe you're not quite ready for a relationship. Maybe you're just auditioning someone for a part in a play she's directing. And I'm not looking for a role like that. She wore sunglasses inside, which should have told me everything. Not big movie star ones either, those narrow, rectangular ones that make people look like they're judging everything they see. She didn't take them off when she sat down across from me at the booth. I couldn't tell if it was because of style or if she was just trying to make a point. Either way, it set the tone. This wasn't going to be a normal date. This was going to be something else. We were at a burger place she picked, retro-themed but clearly new, with fake vintage signs and milkshakes served in mason jars. The kind of place where fries come in little metal buckets and someone wrote peace, love, and ketchup on the wall in neon. She slid into the seat and said, "Sorry I was late. My other date ran long." I thought she was joking, so I laughed. She didn't. She took off her jacket, revealing a black crop top with the words, "Emotional Chaos Club," printed across the chest, and finally pulled off the sunglasses like it was a reward I'd earned. She had intense eyes, the kind that made you feel like she already knew 3 things about you that you hadn't even admitted to yourself. Then she leaned forward and said, "So I don't believe in monogamy. Let's just get that out of the way." I was still unfolding my napkin. She said it like it was standard first date small talk, like saying you're a pisses or you like dogs. I blinked and said, "Okay," because what else are you supposed to say when someone opens with that? She smiled and dipped a fry in her milkshake like it was a ritual. Then she went into it, her whole relationship philosophy, like she practiced it in front of a mirror. She said exclusivity is a trap designed by insecure people, that true love is expansive and doesn't shrink when someone new comes along. I nodded slowly, trying to absorb it all, and then she added, "But I expect the people I'm dating to only date me." I blinked again. "Wait, what?" She repeated it. "I'm polyamorous, but I expect exclusivity from my partners. It's not a contradiction. It's a boundary." She sipped her shake, like this was the most reasonable statement anyone had ever made. I was trying to figure out if this was some kind of logic test, or if I was just deeply misunderstanding what words meant. I asked her to explain, and she sighed, like I was already exhausting her, and said, "Look, I give love freely. I just don't like to share attention. If I'm giving someone my energy, I need to know it's being received fully. I can love multiple people. They can love one. It's balanced." She said the word balanced with the confidence of someone who's won arguments about this before. The server came by and we ordered. She got a veggie burger, no bun, add avocado, double onion. I ordered something basic just to get the menu out of my hands. As soon as he walked away, she picked right back up where she left off, like there hadn't been a pause. She said she's had 5 boyfriends in the last year. None of them overlapped, but all of them knew about each other. Some were still emotionally active, whatever that meant. I asked if she ever felt guilty, and she said, "Guilt is a product of colonial shame." That sentence knocked something loose in my brain. I tried to ask what she meant, but she waved her hand and said, "It's not important right now. Let's talk about you." She leaned in, resting her chin on her hand, and asked me to describe my relationship with power. Not love, not family. Power. I started to laugh, but stopped because she was dead serious. I gave some half-formed answer about not liking control, and she nodded like she was logging that away. Then she said, "I think I could ruin you in a good way." I didn't know what to say to that. I took a long sip of water and watched as she pulled out a tiny notebook from her bag and started scribbling something down. She said she likes to document her connections because people say the most revealing things when they think they're being chill. I hadn't realized we were being studied. When the food came, she ate fast, like she was on a clock I didn't know about. In between bites, she told me about a guy she dated who cried after she kissed someone else in front of him. She said she respected him more for showing emotion, but dumped him anyway because emotional intensity is only attractive when it's tidy. I asked what she was looking for now, and she said, "A short-term soulmate. Someone who will ruin me a little, but in a poetic way." I asked how you make that poetic, and she said, "By leaving at the right time." She said it while licking fry salt off her fingers like it was a mic drop. After we finished eating, she didn't suggest a second drink or dessert or anything. Just leaned back and said, "This was nice. You're more stable than I expected." I like that. And she asked what I'd do if I fell in love with her tonight. Just casually tossed it out there, like asking if I wanted to split the check. I said I'd probably panic a little and then try to play it cool. She smiled and said, "Cute, I'd probably leave." Then she stood up, tossed a 20 on the table, and said she had somewhere else to be. I offered to walk her out, and she said, "No need. We already met, whatever that meant." I watched her leave, boots loud on the fake tiles, sunglasses back on like she was disappearing into a movie, and I sat there with half a milkshake and the notebook image burned into my brain. She texted me that night, "You were better than I expected. Don't get attached." I didn't reply, not because I wasn't tempted to, but because some people don't date for connection. They date to echo, to see what comes back when they throw themselves into someone else's space. And I didn't want to be the next line in her notebook, underlined and forgotten. We met up at this Middle Eastern cafe with twinkly lights and mismatched chairs that made it feel like someone's eccentric aunt decided to open a hookah bar. I got there early and picked a table near the window, one of those awkward two-seaters where your knees almost touch and every sip of tea feels like an interview. He showed up 5 minutes later in a leather jacket that probably cost too much and said, "Hope you're not allergic to honesty," before even sitting down. I thought it was a joke. It wasn't. He had this look like he just walked out of a poetry reading he hated. Hair tied back, black nail polish chipped on one hand, rings on almost every finger. Confident, not in a loud way, but in the way that made you feel like he knew things you didn't and would only tell you if you passed some unspoken test. He sat down, ordered a Turkish coffee, and told me I had calm eyes and wounded energy. I hadn't even taken off my jacket yet. We did the small talk thing for maybe 5 minutes, where we worked where we grew up, what kind of music we liked. But he wasn't really listening. Not fully. He kept doing this thing where he'd nod along and then suddenly pivot the conversation into something weirdly personal. Like, but I mentioned I had a dog. He asked if I saw it as a reflection of my need for control. Then he told me he was married. Just dropped it in like it was no big deal. I blinked. He took a sip of his coffee and clarified, "I'm married, but it's an open situation. My wife and I both date. It's all above board. I have a contract and everything." I asked him to run that back, and he pulled out his phone and showed me an actual PDF. A legit document with highlighted sections and a title at the top that said Mutual Dating Agreement. It was formatted like a lease. Bullet points, conditions, clauses. I stared at it and tried to pretend this was just a regular Tuesday. He said the contract was something they came up with after his wife realized monogamy wasn't congruent with their evolution. His words, not mine. He said it helped set boundaries, expectations, and rules for dating other people, like no sleepovers more than twice a week and prior approval before introducing new partners to pets. I thought he was king. He wasn't. I asked him why he was on a dating app if he was married, and he said, "Love isn't linear." Then he added, "And connection is too sacred to be limited by state paperwork." I didn't even know where to start with that one. I asked him what his wife was like, and he said, "Smarter than me, more grounded, better taste in candles." Then he paused and said, "But you and I, we got a different kind of pull." I asked what that meant, and he said, "There's something in your silence. I can feel it." I wasn't being silent. I was stunned. He leaned in and said he liked how I didn't flinch when he told me about the marriage. Said most people either storm off or get weirdly competitive. I told him I was still processing. He said processing is beautiful and that I was emotionally honest by default. Then he asked if I'd ever consider being part of a triad. I thought he meant something gin-related for a second. He clarified. Said he and his wife had been talking about expanding their dynamic, and he thought I might vibe with both energies. I told him I didn't even know what that meant. He said I'd learn. That love was a spectrum of intimacy, not a ladder. He pulled out a notebook, one of those black moleskin ones with the elastic strap, and started scribbling. I asked what he was doing, and he said he likes to document first impressions in real time. Said it helps him stay honest. Then he looked up and said, "I'm writing that you seem soft but unpredictable. That's rare." At this point, I wasn't even mad, just deeply confused. It felt like I was on a date with a self-aware cult member who also happened to be really into contract law. I asked him what he was looking for, and he said, "A person who's ready to rewrite the story of connection." I said, "Cool, but do you mean dating?" And he said, "Yes, but consciously, with intention, and with respect to the fact that I'm married." I asked what his wife would think of this conversation, and he said she'd be happy for him. Said she supports the journey and that they check in every Sunday to debrief their external engagements. I asked if she dates too, and he said yes, but mostly poets. Then he asked if I'd be willing to read the full contract and consider signing it. Not right away, he clarified. Maybe by the third or fourth meeting. It's more of a guideline than a prison. I said I wasn't really sure how I felt about being someone's part-time emotional partner. He nodded and said, "It's not for everyone, but you don't strike me as everyone." He finished his coffee and asked if I wanted to go somewhere quieter to connect more authentically. I said I had an early morning. He smiled and said, "That's okay. Sometimes the flame just flickers instead of catching." Then he pulled out a tarot deck and offered to do a reading before we left. I said maybe next time. As we walked out, he handed me a folded page from his notebook. On it he'd written, "You are unspoken thunder. If you ever feel like storming, text me." His number was at the bottom. I never texted. Not because I was angry. He wasn't rude or creepy. He was just somewhere else, living in a world where love is scheduled, documented, and occasionally notarized. I hope he and his wife are happy. I really do. But I'm not looking for a relationship that comes with paperwork. I'm just trying to get through dinner without being asked if I'm spiritually compatible with two people and a candle collection. So this one date, she ordered a drink before I even sat down. Not in a rude way, just fast. Like she'd done this before and didn't feel the need to wait. I walked into the little wine bar she'd picked, a narrow, dimly lit place with hanging plants and soft jazz that made every cough sound like a crime. And she was already sitting at the far end of the bar, red wine in hand, scrolling through her phone like it was keeping her alive. She didn't stand to greet me, just looked up, smiled, and said, "Hey," like we were old friends running into each other at a grocery store. I sat down next to her, shrugged off my jacket, and ordered whatever later they had on draft. She put her phone away and asked how my week had been, but in that autopilot tone people use when they don't actually want the details. I gave her the short version, something about meetings and forgetting to do laundry. She nodded, sipped her wine, and said, "I'm in transition right now." I asked what kind of transition, and she let out a dramatic sigh. Not sarcastic, not cute, dramatic. She turned toward me like we were about to start a very serious conversation and said, "I'm figuring things out. Like life, direction, purpose, all of it." I said, "Cool, me too," because who isn't these days? But she shook her head like I didn't get it. "No, I mean, I'm really figuring things out. I quit my job 2 months ago. I moved out of my place. I'm currently living on a couch in my cousin's apartment while I recenter." She even used air quotes for recenter. I asked what made her quit her job, and she said she doesn't believe in working. I laughed, thinking she was exaggerating. She wasn't. She explained that she views work as a trap for the masses, and that she's on a journey to divest from capitalist constructs. She said it like she was reciting something from a zine. She used the phrase toxic productivity culture at least 3 times in the next minute. I nodded along, not really sure where this was going, until she said, "So obviously, I'm not planning on working in the future either." I paused. Like, ever. She nodded, completely serious. Why would I? Life's about joy and alignment, not labor. I asked how she was supporting herself right now, and she said she was taking some time off between support systems. I asked what that meant, and she explained that she was hoping to eventually find a partner who could financially support her while she focuses on creative healing. That's when she hit me with it. "So let me just ask now, would you be open to supporting a partner financially while they discover their true path?" It wasn't even halfway through the first drink. I blinked. Twice. I asked if this was something she brought up with everyone or just when the vibe felt right. She said she tries to be upfront as early as possible. Said it's not fair to let someone get attached if they're not aligned with her lifestyle goals. Then she smiled like she'd just given a really good TED talk and asked, "So how do you feel about long-term generosity?" I wanted to say something polite, but all that came out was a confused, "Wait, you're looking for a sponsor." She frowned and said that word was reductive. She preferred provider partner, someone who values her emotional contributions and sees financial support as part of a holistic relationship. I asked what kind of emotional contributions she meant, and she said presence, nurturing, ideas, energy. Then she added, "I'm really good at being a muse." That was when I realized we were on completely different planets. I was still trying to decide if I wanted to splurge for a second beer, and she was out here talking about becoming someone's full-time passion project. She wasn't joking. She laid it all out, said she's had a few short-term patrons before but is looking for something more stable now. A home. A steady stream of income. someone who believes in her potential to create beauty from rest. She told me she writes poetry, does some light photography, and once had an idea for a podcast that would involve interviewing strangers about their spiritual wounds. She hasn't started it yet, but it's very alive in her mind. She said she doesn't want a traditional relationship with obligations and schedules. She wants something flowy, something generous, something soft. I asked if she was seeing anyone else, and she said not currently, but she's always open to multiple connections, as long as the primary one is sustainable. I didn't even ask what sustainable meant because I already knew money. I tried to ask if she'd ever consider working part-time or freelancing or doing anything at all that might contribute financially. She said no, said that any kind of employment drains her spirit and clouds her intuition. She said she wants her days to be filled with tea, journaling, and making playlists for her future self. Then she asked if I'd ever considered becoming a minimalist. I said I hadn't, and she said I had provider energy, but also some scarcity fear. That I probably needed to do some inner child work around abundance. She said it with the same tone someone might use to tell you your shoelace was untied. The server came by to check in, and I asked for the check. I said I had to be up early, and she nodded like she expected that, like she knew I wasn't going to invest. She didn't look upset, just slightly disappointed, like she'd been handed the wrong order at a coffee shop. Outside, she gave me a hug and said, "You're sweet. I hope you find someone whose purpose aligns with yours." And she looked up at the sky like she was about to burst into a monologue and walked off without saying goodbye. I got home and sat on my couch in silence, thinking about what just happened. I wasn't even mad, just stunned. Like I'd been on a date with a beautifully dressed LinkedIn scam. She knew what she wanted. She wasn't lying. She wasn't shady. She just had a life plan that required someone else to pay for it. And I get it, life is hard. Capitalism is exhausting. But if you're out here treating dating like a grant application, at least by the first round. He messaged me the day before with, "Heads up, I'm working through some stuff, but I'm excited to meet you." That should have been enough to tell me something was coming, but I figured everyone's working through something, and I'm not exactly a beacon of emotional perfection either. So I gave him the benefit of the doubt and said, "Cool, me too." We met at this trendy little coffee spot where every drink is made with oat milk unless you specifically beg for regular. It was full of plants, mismatched furniture, and baristas who looked like they all write poetry but only publish it on Instagram stories. I got there first, sat down at a two-person table near the window, and tried not to eavesdrop on the couple next to me arguing about crystals. He walked in 5 minutes later wearing a hoodie that said, "Healing in Progress," which now feels less like fashion and more like a disclaimer. He was tall, kind of scruffy in a way that could have been intentional or just lazy, and smiled like he was already worried I wouldn't like him. We said hey, hugged awkwardly, and sat down. He had this nervous energy, like his thoughts were moving faster than his words could keep up. We ordered drinks. He got chamomile tea, I got a cold brew, and about 3 sips into our conversation, he just dropped it. "So, just to be upfront, my therapist thinks I should be dating right now." I blinked. "Oh, yeah," he said. "It's part of my healing journey, like exposure therapy for intimacy." Then he smiled like this was cute and not deeply intense. I didn't even know how to respond. I was still trying to figure out how to pronounce Avarissa's name on my receipt, and this guy was using me to confront emotional trauma head on. He clarified that he's not using dating as a distraction. He's using it to process things in real time. Said it's all part of his therapist's strategy to help him open up again. I asked if he felt ready to date. He shrugged and said, "I don't know. That's why I'm here." Then he asked if I'd be willing to help him unpack some things. Like, literally said that. "Help me unpack some things." I thought maybe he meant a casual venting session. Nope. He pulled out a notebook, a spiral-bound one with little doodles in the margins. He said he'd written down some patterns from his last relationship and wanted my take on whether they were red flags or just growth points. I should have left. I really should have. But something about his complete lack of filter kept me sitting there. He was a train wreck, but not in a dangerous way. More like a DIY project someone gave up on halfway through. So I stayed. He flipped to a page titled "Reasons We Didn't Work" and started reading them out loud. One was, "I emotionally shut down when I feel vulnerable," and another was I overcompensate with gifts when I feel guilty. Then he looked up at me and said, "Do those seem fixable?" I had no idea what to say. I told him I wasn't a therapist, and he said, "Yeah, but sometimes strangers give the clearest insight." And he asked me what my biggest emotional wound was. I choked a little on my cold brew, told him that felt a bit personal for a first date, and he said, "Totally fair. But if you had to name one." I laughed mostly out of shock and gave him a vague answer about trust issues. He nodded like he'd just solved a riddle and said, "Same. Mine stemmed from early abandonment, probably." He told me about his last breakup in excruciating detail. Not just what happened, but what he felt every day of the breakup process. Described how he used to cry while brushing his teeth, how he made a playlist to cry into in his car after therapy, how he once wrote a poem titled "You Took My Favorite Hoodie," and my We met at a bookstore bar, which sounds a lot cuter than it was. The lights were dim, but not in a romantic way, more in a someone forgot to pay the electric bill kind of way, and the coffee smelled like it had been sitting in the pot since last Tuesday. Still, I liked the vibe. Quiet, cozy, nobody trying to impress anyone. She picked the spot. Said she liked places where people didn't talk too loud. I took that to mean she was introverted or at least chill. I was wrong. She showed up wearing an oversized sweater, leggings, and these beat-up sneakers that looked like they'd been through a few storms. She was holding a book like it was a weapon. Not just any book. A massive 500-page novel that looked like it could double as a doorstop. She walked in, saw me, and waved like we were already friends. No awkward intro, no small talk. She sat down and immediately asked, "What's the last thing you cried over?" I hadn't even opened the menu yet. I told her I didn't cry often, which was a lie, but I wasn't about to open with the fact that I recently got emotional watching a video of a dog reunited with its owner. She squinted at me and said, "Repressed. We'll work on that." I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. She launched into a rant about how most people are emotionally constipated and how society trains men to suppress their feelings until they implode and buy a motorcycle. She said her goal was to break emotional patterns in everyone she dated, like she was some kind of feelings chiropractor. I nodded, took a sip of water, and asked if she wanted to look at the drink menu. She waved it off and said she brought her own tea bags and pulled out a Ziploc full of them from her purse. I swear on everything, just a handful of loose tea bags. She asked the server for hot water like this was normal. She didn't order food. Said she was on the cleansing cycle and that ingesting anything besides liquid or raw intention would throw off her energy. I didn't know what that meant, so I ordered a sandwich and tried not to feel weird about eating in front of someone who was sipping on peppermint leaves she smuggled into a cafe. She asked about my childhood. Not in a casual way either, like in a "how did your parents speak to you during conflict" kind of way. She had follow-ups. She said, "Interesting, a lot," then paused like she was taking notes in her head. At one point, she asked me to close my eyes. I said, "Why?" And she said, "I want to see what kind of energy you radiate when you're not performing." I thought she might be joking. She wasn't. She reached across the table and lightly touched my forehead. Not a slap, not a push, just like a blessing. I opened my eyes and she said, "You got a lot of air energy, but I think you're a water sign in disguise." I'm not. I told her that. She said astrology is more intuitive than factual. She had this way of talking like everything was a theory she came up with that morning and fully believed in. She said time wasn't real, monogamy was a capitalist construct, and that the best way to measure someone's character was by watching how they treat birds. I didn't know how to respond to that last one, so I said, "I like birds." She smiled like I passed a test. While I was trying to finish my sandwich, she told me she once broke up with a guy because he had bad oral hygiene. I asked what that meant, and she said, he carried sadness like a disease and didn't want to do the work. Then she asked if I'd be willing to scream into a pillow with her if we ever hit a rough patch. She said it was the healthiest way to process conflict. I asked her what she did for work, and she said, "That's not the question I asked myself." I blinked. She explained that she doesn't work in the traditional sense, but she participates in the flow of exchange. I eventually figured out that she sells handmade candles online and occasionally hosts moon circles. I didn't know what a moon circle was, and I didn't ask. At one point, she asked if I believed in reincarnation. I said maybe. She nodded, then told me she'd seen a past version of herself in a dream once, and she was a blacksmith in a small village and deeply in love with someone who looked like me. I said, "That's a lot." She said, "It's fate." She offered me a tarot reading halfway through the date, right there in the cafe, while my plate still had crumbs on it. She pulled out a tiny deck from her purse and spread the cards across the table like she'd done this hundreds of times. People were staring. She didn't care. She drew 3 cards, frowned, and said, "Your sacral chakra is underdeveloped, but your heart's trying." Then she reached into her pocket and handed me a small crystal. "Keep this on you for 3 days," she said. "Let me know if your dreams shift." I nodded slowly and slipped it into my jacket like I wasn't absolutely baffled by what was happening. The date ended after she told me she'd already journaled about this connection, but that she needed space to meditate on it before seeing me again. She hugged me tight, whispered something in a language I didn't recognize, and walked off without saying goodbye, just disappeared into the sidewalk crowd like she'd evaporated. She texted me the next day to say her spirit guides were unsure but optimistic. I didn't reply. Because sometimes a date isn't about compatibility, it's about surviving a full hour in another person's universe. And hers definitely had its own gravity. I'm still carrying that crystal either way. Not because I believe in it. I just haven't figured out how to throw it away without feeling cursed. We met at a little taco place tucked between a laundromat and a vape shop. One of those casual spots with 3 kinds of hot sauce on every table and a menu written entirely on a chalkboard. It wasn't romantic, but I liked it for that reason. No pressure, no candles, no violence, just tacos and horchata. I was early, sat by the window, and scrolled through my phone while waiting. When she walked in, I recognized her right away. Big smile, high ponytail, floral dress like she was on her way to a picnic that didn't exist. She hugged me as soon as she sat down. No handshake, no awkward wave, just a full hug like we'd known each other longer than 10 minutes. Then she said, "I already ordered something for us to share. I hope you like pineapple." I told her I did, even though I didn't, because honestly it felt too early to cause a ripple. She leaned in like she was about to tell me something really juicy and said, "I feel like this is gonna go really well. I had a dream about someone with your name last night." I laughed a little nervously, and she grinned like she'd been waiting for me to do that. She asked about my week, my job, if I liked my apartment, and then casually mentioned that she'd already Googled my building. I thought she was joking until she started talking about the school district it was in. She knew the name of the closest elementary school. She said it had decent arts funding and strong test scores for the area. I stared at her. "How do you know that?" She just smiled and said, "It's always good to be informed." The food came, which helped distract from the fact that she was casually researching my zip code like we were shopping for joint custody. But then, while we were eating, she asked if I liked the name Emery. I said it was cool. She smiled like I passed a test and said, "Good. I've always imagined naming my daughter Emery. It sounds strong but poetic." I nodded slowly, thinking she might be one of those people who just likes baby names for fun. But then she followed up with, "And Milo for a boy. Milo feels like someone who grows up to be emotionally intelligent." I stared at my taco like it might have answers. She took another bite, then looked me dead in the eye and said, "I've thought about what our kids would look like. You have really kind eyes. I think they'd inherit that." I laughed again, nervous laugh number 2, and asked how many kids she wanted, just to see what would happen. She said, 2, maybe 3. Depends on where we settle down. I'm thinking somewhere near the coast, but not touristy. I took a long sip of water and tried to change the subject. I asked about her job, her friends, what show she was watching. She answered quickly, then pivoted right back. Said she didn't want to waste time pretending she wasn't here for something real. She said dating's gotten too casual, and she's not interested in seeing how things go. She wants to build something. "People act like planning is a red flag," she said. "But I think it's clarity." She told me she already had a Pinterest board titled Future Nest, and that she'd picked out color schemes for different seasons. Spring was soft yellows and sage green. Fall was burnt orange and navy. She'd bookmarked articles about parenting styles and bookmarked even more about gentle discipline and early childhood literacy. I nodded like I was watching a documentary about someone else's life. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone to show me a saved folder in her Maps app titled Dream Neighborhoods. She had little pins near where I live. One of them was labeled near him. She showed it to me. Just held it up with zero shame, like it was a photo of a new puppy and not digital evidence of a premature fantasy. She said she'd looked at apartment listings in my area and found a few walkable neighborhoods with dog parks and farmers markets. Then she asked, "Would you be open to splitting school drop-offs?" I stared at her, thinking maybe she meant in some vague, future, general sense, but no, she meant ours. It's better for the kids to have both parents visible in the mornings. I asked if she said this kind of stuff on all her dates, and she said, "Only when it feels right." Then she added, "And I can tell you're not scared of commitment. You got that energy." I said I wasn't scared, just surprised. She smiled like that was the most romantic thing I could have said. She reached across the table and touched my hand lightly, like we were already in month 7 of something that hadn't even made it past guacamole. She said she had a good feeling about us and that she'd already journaled about meeting someone this week. She said, "I think our timing lines up. I'm ovulating too, which just feels symbolic." I didn't even blink that time. I just nodded slowly like my soul had left my body and was now hovering above the table, watching this unfold like a play with bad lighting. When the check came, she offered to split, and I let her. Not because I didn't want to pay, but because I needed a moment to reset my brain. She folded her receipt, tucked it into her wallet, and said, "This was lovely. I'm going to sleep well tonight." I said I was glad to hear that. She stood up, hugged me again, tighter this time, and whispered, "Tell Emery and Milo I said hi." I walked home trying to remember if I'd mentioned my exact building in our chats. I hadn't. She texted me that night to thank me for being so aligned and said she'd already looked up some books we could read together on conscious co-parenting. I didn't answer. She texted again the next morning with a screenshot of a Montessori school, just 10 minutes from your place. I still didn't reply. And I get it, some people like to dream big. Some people are just planners. But there's a difference between vision and projection. And when you're naming hypothetical children before we even split the check, you're not dating me. You're dating a version of me you created in your head. I never agreed to be Milo's dad. I just came for tacos. I knew something was off before he even said a word. He walked into the cafe wearing a shirt that had a political slogan on it, big letters, impossible to ignore, and not neutral either. The kind of slogan that starts Facebook arguments and makes holiday dinners tense. The barista glanced at it and immediately looked away like she wanted no part in whatever was about to happen. I looked down at my own outfit, just jeans and a hoodie, and wondered if I was underdressed or just out of place entirely. He smiled wide and said, "You're even cuter than your pictures," which would have been a nice start if it hadn't been followed immediately by, "And I can already tell you're a fighter." I asked what that meant, and he said I had activist eyes. That didn't feel like a real thing, but I let it go. We sat down at a small table near the window. I picked it earlier so we could people watch or pretend to be distracted if the conversation got weird. Turns out we would need the backup. He launched into his pitch before the server even took our order. "I just want to be upfront," he said. "I don't date anyone who's politically disengaged. If you're not out there doing something, you're part of the problem." Then he asked if I canvass. Not have I ever canvassed, just do I canvass, like it's something everyone's doing every weekend after brunch. I told him I volunteered for a few things before, donated to some causes, and kept up with the news. He nodded slowly like that was a decent start, then said, "But are you active? Like, can I count on you to show up with me? Rain or shine?" I asked for what exactly, and he said, "Whatever the fight is that day." Then he pulled a flyer out of his jacket, not a joke. A real printed flyer for some local protest happening next weekend. He slid it across the table and said, "I'm bringing a few people. You should come. It'll be good bonding." I hadn't even ordered coffee yet. When the server finally came, I got a cappuccino and he got black coffee, no sugar, and made a comment about how sugar is capitalism's sweet distraction. The server laughed nervously and walked away. I wasn't sure what to say. I sipped my water and tried to steer the conversation to something light. Movies, music, food. He swatted every topic away like a fly. "I don't watch mainstream stuff," he said. "Media is designed to pacify. I only watch documentaries and grassroots films." When I asked if there was a show he liked for fun, he said, Fun is subjective. I prefer productive. He reached into his bag, because of course he had a bag, and pulled out a small stack of zines. One of them had a hand-drawn title that said, The Romance of Resistance, and he handed it to me like it was a mixtape. He told me he'd written it himself, said it was about how love in its purest form should be a partnership in revolution. I asked if that meant emotional support or like running a newsletter together. He said both. Then he asked what causes I'd be willing to go to jail for. I laughed thinking he was joking. He wasn't. He told me that real relationships are forged in shared struggle, that brunch dates and rom-coms are tools of distraction, and that if we're not building something that could overthrow systems of oppression, we're wasting each other's time. I asked if he ever just relaxed, and he said, rest is resistance, but only if it's intentional. He asked if I was registered to vote. I said yes. He asked if I vote in local elections. I said usually. He raised an eyebrow like I'd said I kick puppies for sport. Halfway through the date, he looked around the cafe and said, you can always tell who's really awake by who notices how the space is designed. Then he pointed out how the place only had individual seating near outlets, which he claimed was a metaphor for capitalist isolation. I looked around and realized I had absolutely no opinion about the outlet placement, and suddenly felt very underprepared. Then he said, by the way, I expect whoever I'm dating to invest with me every weekend. It's kind of non-negotiable. I asked if that was a hypothetical expectation or an actual job requirement. He said it's how he filters out the unserious. If you won't knock on doors with me, how can I trust you to fight for a future with me? I asked if he ever just went out for a walk without turning it into a demonstration, and he said walks are great, especially if they're part of a community reclamation effort. I nodded like that sentence made sense. At one point, I asked what his last relationship ended over. He said she got soft, that she started caring more about dinner parties and less about showing up to meetings. He said, you can't build a revolution with someone who's obsessed with houseplants. I happen to like houseplants. A lot. I made a mental note not to bring that up. I finished my cappuccino and said I needed to get going soon. He asked if I wanted to sign up for a shift at the mutual aid table this Saturday. I said I'd think about it. He said, if you do, wear something with a message. People need to see who we are. I said I'd check my schedule. He nodded like I was trying his patience, but still possibly savable. As we walked out, he handed me another flyer. This one was for a discussion group called Couples Against Capital. He said, even if this doesn't go anywhere, you should come. We need more conscious energy in the room. I thanked him, got in my car, and drove home feeling like I had been part of a public service announcement I didn't sign up for. He texted later that night, thanks for showing up. Most people wouldn't even take the meeting. I didn't reply, not because I didn't care about anything he said. I do care. I vote, I donate, I try. But there's a difference between sharing values and being recruited into someone's campaign. I don't want to be a plus one to a political identity. I want a person. A human being who can laugh, rest, talk about nonsense, and maybe share a cappuccino without turning it into a revolution. This wasn't one of those disaster dates you tell at parties for laughs. No one got catfished. No one turned out to be secretly married or living under a different name. It was, in a way, worse than that, because nothing technically happened. There was no single red flag moment, no dramatic exit. Just a slow, creeping weirdness that settled over the afternoon like fog. The kind of experience that doesn't scar you, but lingers. You don't bring it up often, but when you're lying in bed and your brain wants to be unkind, it resurfaces. His name was Thomas. We met through an app I use mostly for scrolling while avoiding responsibilities. His profile wasn't anything remarkable, blurry outdoor shots. One of him on a hiking trail, another of a dog I wasn't entirely convinced belonged to him. His bio was short, vague, and that I have thoughts but don't want to scare anyone kind of way. He messaged me first, not flirty, not sleazy, just polite if a little dry. I wasn't expecting sparks, but I also wasn't expecting what happened. Instead of the usual want to grab coffee line, he suggested something different. The art museum downtown. He said he liked quieter places, ones that gave you space to think and talk if you wanted or just wander. That actually struck me as kind of cool. It felt like a break from the routine. No overpriced drinks. No pretending we both love reading old Russian novels in tiny cafes. Just art. I've only been to that museum once, ages ago on a school trip, but I remembered the echoing hallways and strange sculptures. It sounded low pressure, which was all I really wanted. We met on a Saturday afternoon. He was already there, waiting near the fountain out front, staring at a cluster of pigeons like he expected them to do something meaningful. I remember thinking that he looked just like his photos, only a bit taller. His posture was oddly stiff, like his body didn't quite know where to be, but not in a way that felt threatening. Just unsure, like he was always bracing for the next moment. We exchanged a quick, slightly awkward hello and walked in. Got our little admission stickers, grabbed a map, and started wandering through the galleries. At first, it was fine. We meandered through the abstract section, staring at big canvases with strange shapes and titles that felt like riddles. He talked a lot. Not about himself, about the art. Long, winding thoughts about form and shadow, and stillness and chaos. He said things like, "I appreciate spaces that feel emotionally quiet." I nodded, pretending to follow, though half the time I wasn't sure what he meant. He wasn't boring, but he didn't seem fully present either, like he was having a much deeper experience than the rest of us were invited to. Then we reached the sculpture wing. That's where it shifted. This room was different, bright and clean, with smooth white walls and high ceilings that made your footsteps sound too loud. Dozens of sculptures stood on pedestals, some modern and jagged, others classical and graceful. The centerpiece was impossible to miss, a tall marble figure of a woman, arms lifted, head tilted slightly back as if caught mid-dance. It was striking. The kind of piece that grabs your attention for a second whether you want it to or not. I looked at it, registered the detail, the pose, the way the light hit the surface. I moved on. But Thomas didn't. He stopped walking, stood completely still, maybe 10 feet from the statue, and stared. At first, I figured he was just really taking it in, analyzing texture or symmetry, or whatever artsy people think about. I glanced at him, expecting a comment. Nothing. His expression had changed, more focused, more intense. His breathing, too, had taken on a kind of rhythm that felt deliberate. I don't know how to explain what happened next exactly. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to in court, but something shifted in the room. In him. In me. I didn't want to assume anything weird, so I looked away, gave him space, pretended to examine another sculpture, but something about his silence, the way he was fixated on that one figure, made me deeply uncomfortable. It felt less like he was admiring the art, and more like he was lost inside it, not emotionally moved, consumed, like the rest of the room had vanished for him. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed him adjust his stance. A small movement, maybe nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. His body language had changed, tense, uncertain, self-aware in a way that made my skin crawl. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. But the longer I stood there, the worse it got. The silence in the room felt sharp, almost pressurized. Then he mumbled something. I didn't catch the words, just the tone. Quiet, breathless, private, like he'd forgotten I was there, or didn't care. That was when I decided to leave. I said I needed the bathroom and turned without waiting for a response. I walked briskly through the halls, heart pounding, not from fear exactly, but from that horrible, skin-prickling discomfort that comes from seeing something you weren't supposed to see. I didn't go to the bathroom. I headed straight for the gift shop and hovered near the postcards, trying to steady my nerves. A few minutes later, he appeared behind me, casual as anything. Asked if I wanted to check out the photography exhibit. I told him I had a headache. He seemed disappointed, but didn't argue. I said I was calling an Uber, and that was the end of the date. That night, he texted me a simple, "Had a good time today," like everything had been perfectly normal. I didn't reply. I never blocked him, but I never answered either. I told one friend what happened. She didn't believe me at first, and she laughed. Then she looked horrified. I still don't know how to describe the experience in a way that makes people understand. Because it wasn't loud or dangerous or overt. It was quiet. Weird in a way that sticks to you, not because it escalated, but because it didn't. Now, every time someone mentions going to the museum, I think of that cold room, the echo of our footsteps, and Thomas, motionless in front of that statue like he'd forgotten I was even there. And I think, never again.